So, I was on the internet the other day, and I happened to come across a video discussing the year in review. And one of the things that I seem to come across a lot in this kind of video is the idea that virtual reality headsets are just going to be this passing fad. And the one thing I always hear is, I'll give it like 6 months and it's going to be more dead than motion controls. You ever hear someone's opinion and you just want to reach into your computer screen and slap them for it? And no, this isn't about virtual reality headsets. This is about motion control being dead. Motion control is not dead. It is not dying. It is not going anywhere anytime soon. Yes, Sony has more or less locked the PlayStation Move just to PlayStation VR. Yes, the Kinect has been more or less phased out of Microsoft's immediate plans. And yes, the motion control of the Wii has been downplayed for the Wii U. This is all true. However, motion control is still there. It's just not as in your face. And some good examples I can think of offhandedly. When was the last time you played a racing game that didn't have you twist your phone? And this is just on mobile here. Or how about played one of the things I keep coming across is in Zelda games on the 3DS, when you pull out the bow, the gyro controls take over. It does the same thing on Wii U, and you have to turn those off. Pokemon Sun and Moon recently had the Poke Finder feature. Pokemon Go on mobile has the feature that superimposes the sprite onto the real-life backgrounds, and where you have your phone pointed can make all the difference in a capture. Motion control is still around. And if you want to say, oh, that's only mobile and Nintendo doing that, how about The Last of Us Remastered, where you still need to shake your controller to get that damn flashlight to start working again? Motion control did not go anywhere. It just stopped being a selling point. And in the absence of it being a selling point, a lot of the controversy died down because it was no longer in our faces. I mean, think about it. When Nintendo released the Wii, what was the biggest complaint about it? I mean, aside from the fact that it didn't have graphics out the ass. It was that it was a kiddie system with lots and lots of shovelware games, all based around this motion control gimmick, none of which were any good. And you know what you didn't hear a lot of people talking about? The use of motion control in Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, in Twilight Princess. You know, when people talk about Twilight Princess, nobody complains about the controls. Some of these people, it's because they were playing on GameCube, which had the better control scheme, but the motion controls in Twilight Princess are not really complained about that much. Skyward Sword, it's a little different because, again, it was right in your face, and opinions are more split on Skyward Sword's controls than any other game in the franchise. However, motion controls got their reputation not because they are inherently bad, but because right when they started to become commonplace, they attracted vultures. Third parties that wanted to create a quick discount dollar bin video game that they could drop on the market, maybe rake in a little cash, and then move on. Cash in on this fad, and then pretend like it never happened. When we first got our Wii, there was a game that we rented from Blockbuster called Furu Furu Park. And this was one of those mini-game collections. And we played it once. You know, Super Smash Bros. Brawl, which we rented in the same weekend, I at least went back to it at least 2 or 3 times more. Because, you know, it's friggin' Super Smash Bros. It's a good game. Furu Furu Park didn't really care about whether or not you played it more than once. it was a shovelware game, and you saw a lot of those when the Wii first came out. I think the only motion control heavy game that I ever... the only motion control heavy game that was not Nintendo made that I played more than once or twice was Rayman Raving Rabbids. And that was because the first one was actually kind of good. It had some decent uses for the motion control. It was not perfect. It had some issues with some games where you needed finely tuned control. And a combination of shaky hands and slightly imprecise controls made that a little bit difficult. But at the same time, overall, it was a solid game that still used motion control in every aspect of gameplay. This was a game that more or less set the standard for how motion control minigame collections should have been. And then all the sequels pretended like that shit never happened. They were mediocre at best, annoying at worst. So, motion control in the past couple years has been allowed to be subtle, and nobody complains about it anymore because it's not shoved in their face. Well, you know what I've heard about a lot in regards to VR games? How much Arkham VR sucked. And how this new technology is going to be nothing more than a toy for hobbyists for 6 months before they realize how stupid it is and go back to gamepad / mouse and keyboard like the good little drones they are. Here's the thing. VR is a very different beast from motion controls. It is... First off, it's a technology that has only recently become doable well. You know, never forget the Virtual Boy. Never forget that. It can be done badly. And the one VR device that people have been complaining about, the PlayStation Move, did it badly. I mean, you don't get much worse than, in order to use this wonder device to its fullest potential, you're going to have to buy an entirely new version of our system in order to make that work. It's the PS4 Pro, and it plays some of your games in 4K. So, first off, it more or less required the PS4 Pro to run at a decent frame rate. It required it to run at a decent resolution, but the technology was still held back by the archaic way they integrated motion control into it, because they chose to reuse the old PlayStation Move in place of actual new controls. And, I remember back in 2013, when they announced the PS4 and they announced the Move would be compatible, there was a resounding cry of, "Why?" from the gaming populace, because nobody could figure out what they were going for here. The PS Move basically landed on the scene with a gigantic splat. You bought it for the gimmick, if you bought it at all, and then, 1 or 2 games supported it. I don't know how well. I'm inclined to believe not well, if they stopped supporting it as hard as they did. I only own one game that's PS Move compatible, and that is BioShock Infinite, which I don't even know how you would play that on a PS Move without it feeling very, very stilted, uncomfortable, and not very fun to play at all. The thing with VR, though, is they chose to use this archaic control system. They have a light bar on the front of the headset that makes it impossible to turn around. It is just a bad VR system. And I've heard so many good things about the HTC Vive from people who have paid for the HTC Vive and can actually have the computing power to use the HTC Vive. VR, yes, is going to be a hobbyist's interest. It is not going to replace televisions. It is not going to give us Sword Art Online, .hack, or any of that shit where you actually go inside the video game. It is not going to be able to do that for a very long time, and I'm fairly certain that the PS9, when it does come out, is not going to live up to Sony's 1999-2000 predictions of projecting the game inside your brain. It's not going to be able to do that. Although the glassy orb aesthetic would be very cool. Sony, if you could work on that, that would be a very cool thing to have sitting underneath my TV. That aside, VR is in its infancy. And the launch that the PSVR had basically had interactive stories for very much of it. It had games that looked very, very, very pretty sometimes. And they worked, sort of. I'm not going to go as far as to say that the PSVR had a terrible launch, because it's now been about 3 or 4 months. Sony is still talking about the PSVR, so it is at the very least doing better than the Vita. The thing is, though, people wanted more. What people want right now is for VR to be integrated into their current gaming experience. And what we're getting is largely the same thing that motion control had to deal with in its early days. Games where it's built entirely around the motion control and not always very well. It's like Game Party was one of the launch titles for the Wii, and it's regarded as one of the worst games of all time. It was a motion control minigame nightmare. It was not very good, and if you played it more than once, it's probably because you wanted to show someone how shit a minigame collection could be. Arkham VR, to me, every time I hear about it, sounds basically like the same thing. They built a game based around the new technology that's intended to basically just be a tech demo that they're selling at full price to make a quick buck and then move on. This is not what VR has to be. I have seen a lot of games on Steam that utilize VR. And a lot of them are, yes, quirky minigames. There are a lot of really neat indie ideas that have integrated Oculus and Vive support that seem like they could be a lot of fun. Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes, Calm Down Stalin, Tabletop Simulator. These are all games that seem like they could be good. It's just that consoles got Arkham VR. This is the problem that VR is going to have to approach. And it's going to have to approach it in a different way than motion controls did. Because companies milked motion controls in the same way for 3 years, and then people stopped buying the Wii. And then by the time the Wii U came out, nobody cared about motion controls. So Nintendo had to look at this alternative system, and basically their marketing fucked them over. Now, that said, if AAA games want to have an aspect of VR, the first thing they do, and this is the first thing they need to do, is add VR as an option to their mainstream titles. Like, for instance, if Call of Duty and Battlefield, I know he's mentioning Call of Duty and Battlefield, they are first-person shooters. First-person games should have been the first and only things to get VR. If you're going to put out this new technology, you need to give us good reasons from the outset to use it. And I know that there's this thing that AAA companies don't want to approach, where the idea of putting on a VR headset and going to war is going to disturb a lot of people. But here's the thing. It's not the 90s anymore. Jack Thompson has been disbarred for years. Nobody seriously believes anymore that video games make you violent, any more than violent movies make you violent, or violent books make you violent, or that comic books make you stupid, or that Dungeons and Dragons turns you into a Satanist. Nobody believes this shit anymore because video games are a lot more mainstream. Hell, Hatred came out a couple years ago. Hatred, a game that is a murder simulator. And the reaction was kind of, it's a bad game. What are you going to do? So there's no longer this stigma of gamers that we're all ticking time bombs waiting to explode. VR headsets can approach the first-person shooter genre. But it's not just FPSs that can benefit from VR. Games like Tabletop Simulator, or war games, or turn-based and real-time strategy could benefit greatly from VR. Just imagine a real-time strategy game where you can do the bird's eye view thing, but you know how when you use the scroll wheel on like Warcraft 3, you zoom in on the unit? Be able to zoom down like that and then view the battle from multiple angles as it happens. You could do that with MOBAs. And then of course there's, they've already got Starfighter games and racing games. Those are good applications of it as well. They just need to be better Starfighter and racing games. They need to not give people motion sickness, which apparently only the PlayStation VR did. VR is a young technology, and it is far too early to write it off. Sony's probably going to, because anything that's not a home console is a momentary urge that they can't justify to themselves 6 months later. But Oculus and Vive are two very good headsets that could very well wind up eventually becoming a lot more mainstream than they are. The only issue is we need to get over this launch. We need to get some quality VR titles in there. And we need to make VR a supplement to gaming. Not treat it like motion control where it was made central to the game. Make it a supplement that is optional. And then you will start to see public opinion shift. And VR will be a lot more widely accepted than it is.